Hello, and welcome to the Nurturing Resilience podcast, where me, your host, Leisha Nelson, weaves together the worlds of somatics, science, and energetics to nurture a deeper connection to yourself. This is a podcast that covers a span of topics and ideas, from guest storytelling their rites of passage that catalyzed their resiliency, to nervous system and mind-body health education, to deep contemplation on topics such as cultivating connection to ourselves and others in a complex world. I'm an occupational therapist, somatic practitioner, and body worker, attachment specialist, and baby whisperer, with over 20 years of experience with mind-body connection and supporting matrescence. What you're receiving today and listening today is the uncut version of my podcast. This is where I interview guests and I don't do any editing. You're getting it all in the raw. If you're interested in my podcast, you can find that on Spotify, which is the edited version. And if you're interested in my work, you can follow me on Instagram at Leisha Nelson and also through my website at leishanelson.com. If you enjoy what you hear today, if you enjoy this podcast, please share it on your social media pages with your friends, your family, your loved ones. Let the world know that it's here. If you really like it, you can follow me and write a review. That's how my podcast gets out to listeners like you. And this important information about the body, somatics, and nervous system can find more people that need it. All right, thanks so much, and let's dive in. Okay. So today, Kate Kavanaugh, and I'm going to start us off with a quote, which is not something I normally do. But as I was preparing for this podcast, I read this quote, and it has a lot of correlation to my story, how I have heard of your story, which we're going to get into. So we'll start there, and then we'll introduce your story.
I love it. I love starting with a quote. That's a fun way to kick off a podcast.
So this quote comes from Martin Pritchell, who is an author of many, many beautiful books and a shaman. Turn that worthless lawn into a beautiful garden of food, whose seeds and stories sown, whose foods are living origins. Grow a garden on that flat roof of your apartment building. Raise bees on the roof of your garage. Grow onions in the iris bed. Plant fruit and nut trees that bear. Don't plant ornamentals, and for God's sake, don't complain about the ripe fruit staining your carpet and your driveway. Rip out the carpet. Trade food to someone who raises sheep for wool. Learn to weave carpets that can be washed. Tear out your driveway. Plant the 9 kinds of sacred berries of your ancestors. Raise chickens and feed them from your garden. Use your fruit in the garden in the grandest of ways. Grow grapevines, make dolmas, wine. Invite your fastest neighbors over to feast. Get to know them and their ancestral grief that made them prefer a narrow mind. Start gardening together. Turn both of your griefs into food. Instead of converting them, convert their garage into a wine, root, honey, and cheese cellar. Who knows, peace might break out. But if you still have all the beautiful food to feed the rest and the sense of humor the Holy gave you to know you're not worthless, because you can feed both the people and the Holy with your 2 little able fists.
I love that so much. There's a lot to tease out there too, just amongst all the growing of food. But what stuck out today was your neighbors with their ancestral grief and that sense of connection.
Yeah. And what stands out to me in this quote, and what really stands out to me as I've been following your work, is this desire for deeper connection, and having that be through food and through our animals, through our land, through all the many different ways that we can increase or grow our connection. And I've really found that to be true as, the more connected I am with my own food, which I have a passion and a love for, the more healed and whole I feel in myself. And so I would love to hear a little bit of, well, all of your story in your connection with your food and your healing journey and what you found, because there was so much there with your story as you went on that path.
Yeah, I think it really starts with something that you mentioned, and it's seeking more connection. And I think the biggest theme throughout my journey has been a desire to connect more. And each door of connection opened up a deeper longing inside of me for, okay, can I connect even further? How close can I get to something? And so this really started for me in childhood. And I had a difficult childhood, and I had a lot of difficulty in how I connected within my family and with my peers, and trying to find where I fit in the world. And it was a really difficult time for me. And within that, I became kind of obsessed with death. And this is a funny place to be as a kid, but I just was so interested and afraid of and curious about this thing that was death. And through that curiosity, I decided at a very young age that I wanted to become a vegetarian and to stop eating meat around age 5. And my parents indulged me, and this carried on for the next 13 years. And it evolved, I guess 15 years actually. It evolved over time. At first, it was about animals, and it was about avoiding participating in what I saw as death in our food system. Then it became something that was more environmental and animal welfare focused in my punk rock teen years. And then at age 20, I found that I was just utterly depleted, and began to question what was going on with my body and where I could find nourishment. And what kept coming back to me was that I needed to eat meat. And it was this little whisper, like this little nagging whisper, this little call. And I began doing a lot of research about farming and about meat eating. I decided that if I was going to embark on this journey, if I was going to include meat back into my diet, that I wanted to be as closely connected to it as possible, that I wanted to seek that connection. And so through visiting farmers markets, I got to know farmers, I visited their farms, I saw their animals, and I began eating meat again. And I was truly struck at that point in time by how completely and totally it changed my health and my body around. Symptoms of depression, of low energy, of dysregulated menstrual cycles began to just completely reverse. And gut function began to heal. And I was in awe of the healing power of this food and wanted to know more. And through that, started to see how these farmers, I mean, this was 14 years ago, how these farmers were managing their landscapes and what is now called regenerative agriculture, and back then was just, I don't know, good grazing practices, the power of those to heal landscapes. And I knew that I wanted to be closer. And so I learned how to butcher so that I could maybe bridge that gap between farmers and people that were seeking to heal their bodies and be the middleman sort of between soil and human health. That I wanted to traverse both of those spaces. And my husband and I opened up a butcher shop in Denver, Colorado called Western Daughters in 2013. And that really kicked off the journey, and it led into a much more deeper exploration of my own health and getting to witness the health of others, customers that were coming in and using this food as medicine. I became a master nutrition therapist somewhere along the line. And then 2.5 years ago, my husband and I moved to our own farm because I really wanted to raise animals and to experience that level of closeness and to raise all of my own food. And so it really goes back to this idea that you had at the beginning, that it is a constant seeking of deeper connection.
Yeah. Wow. I'm doing a timeline here, and you moved either in the pandemic or shortly after, or
We moved in February of 2020.
okay.
And
So before.
right before, and we did not know what was coming, but it was nice to be here on the farm.
Yeah. Did that affect you in any way that you had this move? You left your butcher shop in Colorado,
Mhm.
and I know this, my listeners might not know this, but you moved from the West to the East, which is a
Yeah.
big move.
Yeah.
So, and a lot of companies had a really hard time during the pandemic and kind of that whole process. Did that affect you at all?
It's funny, the butcher shop, it's a tough business. The margins are very tight, both in ranching and in the selling of good, wholesome food. It's not where the money is. I think that's why we see a lot of processed food, because it's very profitable. And the pandemic was some of our most profitable years at the butcher shop, because there were so many supply chain issues with bigger retailers and box stores, but our pockets, as it were, for meat were bottomless, because we only work within the local food chain and we have standing relationship with ranchers all over the Front Range. And so our only limitations were staffing and storage. For us on the farm, I think it gave us an interesting opportunity to really dig into what it meant to begin to live a very different lifestyle. As much as we missed the element of community, and there weren't the avenues to get to meet people and get to know people in the same way, we did just dive into farming and to connecting with this new landscape, and to really getting to know this little plot of land and our farm and the peaks and valleys and the soil. And I think that was a gift in its own way.
Wow. So many different directions and avenues of where to take this. I think we'll come back eventually to the farm, because I've heard you speak of some different stories and I have a really good girlfriend that runs a farm as well. And so it was actually her who I turned to when I started having some big health issues at the beginning of this year, and was also not a strict vegan, but off and on vegetarian vegan my whole life. I'm now in my 40s. And for me, it would always be because of an injury. Something would happen. And in the first incidents in my 20s, it was my acupuncturist who said, you have to eat meat. Your body is not going to heal. And as soon as I incorporated, my father-in-law was an elk hunter, and that was my way into eating meat for a couple of different reasons. But as soon as I started partaking of his hunting meat, my injury went away. And so I would do this funny circle of like, I don't eat meat. I'm a vegan. I'm a vegetarian. I don't do animal products for personal reasons. And then an injury or a health issue. You talked about regulating your menstrual cycle, like all sorts of issues with my menstrual cycle. And every time I would eat meat, my body would heal. My cycle would normalize. My skin would get better. Like, I
It's
just felt
magic.
good.
Yeah, it's medicine.
It's medicine. And so the beginning of this year, I really went down a really big rabbit hole, and discovered regenerative farming. As you know, that term, it's like, that's the quote unquote word.
Yeah, it's a bit of a buzzword now, but for lack of a better one, it's just the easiest way to get there.
Yeah. So it just put me down these rabbit holes. I decided to visit a local farm that does regenerative farming here in Utah. And anyway, I think a lot of people on this podcast platform don't necessarily know the difference between regenerative farming and traditional agriculture. And I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind explaining that just a tiny bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you touched on something important. And I do want to say this, that oftentimes these terms, whether they're organic or regenerative, get co-opted by the sort of corporate organism in order to greenwash and sell their products. And so these terms get diluted over time.
Mm.
But at the same time, we have to have a shared language for how we talk about different farming practices. And what we're defining within those practices, in my mind, is the relationship between people and soil and people and animals. With regenerative practices, at the heart of them is really a space where we can mimic to the best of our abilities how nature would have created that system and that relationship between land and animal. And that's reciprocal in that the animal is receiving the diet that it evolved to eat, and the land is receiving the impact and nourishment and manure that it evolved to need. And I think that the best example of this is really taking a look at how bison managed the plains. So the Great Plains in the United States used to comprise 40% of the land mass in the United States, which is pretty massive. And they were these complex and beautiful grasslands where grasses would grow perennially, meaning that they're coming back year after year, and they're developing really deep, long tap roots so that they're able to access water beneath the soil and draw water down into the soil and hang on to the soil. And bison would move as a result of predation. So wolves would kind of put bison in this tightly packed little herd that would move across the landscape. And as that happened, their hooves would press seeds into the ground and create some pockets where oxygen could get back in there and feed the soil food web. Their manure added bacteria and mass. Their urine added nitrogen and all of these things that soil requires to be healthy. And then they'd move on and then continue grazing elsewhere. And this creates a really positive pressure for those plants. And so what we want to do inside of regenerative agriculture is ask, how can we manage this landscape in a way that it might have looked 10,000, 20,000 years ago? With the knowledge that now we have fences and smaller pieces of property, and more often than not, we're using domesticated versus wild species like bison. But what we'll do is you'll take a cow or a herd of cows and begin to fence off little mini pastures and move them in these packed herds in a rotational grazing pattern that is going to help improve soil, and it's going to give these cattle access to the nutrition that they evolved to eat, which is 100% grass. And ultimately, it's going to create a stronger ecosystem. It's going to build soil matter. And I think that this is a really crucial place to kind of transition and say that our soil organic matter, we have lost roughly 50%, 50 to 60% of our soil organic matter in the last 200 years across the world.
Wow.
And so this is an unfathomable loss. You have over 1 billion microorganisms in a single teaspoon of soil. This ecosystem is a universe beneath our feet. And the difference is that we know more about space than we do about soil. They often call soil a black box because we understand less than 1% of it. And so this is a very complex, robust, and fascinating ecosystem. Now, I want to switch into conventional farming. And usually people do this in reverse, but I think in some ways it helps to understand this before you understand conventional farming. There are a lot of different levels in between too. And I really want to tease out that there's nuance and there's a spectrum. It's not black or white. And there's a lot of gray in between and different practices. But conventional agriculture is really defined by concentrating, whether it's animals or plants, in favor of yields and convenience. You are taking a large group of hogs or of cattle and you are concentrating them on what's called a concentrated animal feeding operation, a CAFO, where you can feed 1,000, 5,000, 10,000 animals easily. For hogs, they all live in a barn. They don't even see the sunshine. They're just in little cages. Everything is automated in how they're fed, and their manure is ported out into a lagoon that is very toxic and has a lot of issues both for human health and environmental health. So all of these things are just looking to concentrate. If you look at plant agriculture on this scale, which often feeds into animal agriculture, as many of the grains, corn, soy in this country are grown for either animal feed or processed human feed. Something like an Impossible Burger is going to be a really good example of this. You are going to have a massive monocrop of a single plant that is easy to harvest. You're going to use synthetic chemicals and fertilizers that are made from petroleum products that are used to fertilize the soil, and likely these plants are genetically engineered to withstand herbicides and pesticides like glyphosate, which is the most commonly used herbicide. It's a water-soluble toxin, often referred to as Roundup. It's a weed killer and a patented antibiotic, which is against life, that we're applying to these 1 billion microorganisms in a single teaspoon of soil, and a mineral chelator. And so we get minerals from plants in the soil, and we can talk about that later if you want. So it also pulls minerals out of the soil. And we've done this for convenience and for profit, because this is a way that corporate organism begins to make money. And so it's just all concentrated, all condensed, all focused on yields in a somewhat false way, as often regenerative agriculture can produce just as good, if not better, yields. It just takes more human imagining, is what I'm going to call it. And so those are going to really be the differences. One is going to be much more holistic. It's considering systems. It's concerned with qualification instead of quantification. It's concerned with mapping instead of measuring, and really looks at the systems and all the pieces of the whole. And the other is going to be very reductive, looking at single inputs, very focused on quantity.
Wow. Oof. So the reason why my family went vegetarian in the late 80s, and I was, I don't know, like 8 or 9 years old, is my older sister did a report on farming practices and discovered all this. And this was before, I think this was really known. I don't know how my sister did this as a report in high school.
I know, I'm kind of unbelievable.
She was very avant-garde.
Very.
And she took this information after writing this report and brought it home and like read it to my parents at the dinner table and said, I'm a vegetarian and I think you guys need to be as well. Like, this is what's happening. And my parents agreed with her. They were like, what? This is what's happening. And this is how we're treating animals. And this is how they're slaughtered. Like, no, we're not going to participate in that. And so that was my viewpoint for a really, really long time. And not even knowing that regenerative agriculture or other ways, like you said, the spectrum, that there were even other ways of doing meat and allowing it to be.
Yes.
And so when I really started to go down this rabbit hole and understand the mechanisms, my mind was blown. And I guess I'm wondering, and maybe this isn't, I think you might know this question. I'm just wondering, like, what happened? You know, I'm sure there's this moment where we're growing in population, you know, the baby boom, and they're all having lots of children. Like, we're just growing and growing and growing in America. And there has to be a way to feed us on a mass level. And so we move towards this, like, this way of farming to be more productive, but it isn't really more productive. Like, why are we still thinking that this way is the more productive way for producing food?
This is a really complex question. And it's funny that you should ask this because I think that this is very much in the collective unconscious. I asked this of a different guest on my podcast the other day through his lens. And what makes this question difficult is that there are a lot of different pressures that I think personally, right? And this is my perspective on this, that led to this centralization. And I think that that's the first word that we have to begin to unpack, is that sometime around the late 1800s, early 1900s, a couple of different things were happening. There was kind of this dawn of automation and the assembly line, and things were starting to become more concentrated. But there was also a really big push from, honestly, a very few couple of key players in the elite controlling class, for lack of a better term, that really wanted to consolidate things, to focus on patenting things and making money. I think a really good example of this is actually dairy. And so around the 1917, 18, the Rockefellers created a machine that pasteurized and homogenized dairy. Up until this point, most dairy cattle had been on small family farms, or many people in rural communities would just have a cow that would serve them and their community with raw milk that came out of the cow, right? So when we refer to milk fresh out of the cow as raw, it still has a full healthy bacteria component, just like yogurt, that helps it be more digestible and a lot more nourishing. And so Rockefeller creates this machinery that pasteurizes, which means that you heat and kill that bacteria, and homogenizes. Cow's milk is naturally going to separate into cream and skim, and it creates a homogeneous mixture. And at that same time, he pushed for legislation to make raw milk illegal in many states, so that everyone would have to buy and utilize this machinery that homogenized and pasteurized milk, forcing things to become more centralized and to be under an umbrella corporation. And as you begin to tease out any sector within the agricultural industry, there is a similar story. If you look at poultry and Tyson and Purdue chicken, you hear a similar story of patenting genetics and really beginning to create a different bird. Our chickens have increased in size. I think it's by about 430%. I can look that up.
God.
Since the early 1900s, and the genetics for those are held patented by 2 different companies the world over. And so wherever you're looking, you see a push for centralization by a person or corporation in power in order to increase profits. And I mean, I don't know how conspiratorial you want to get about this, and I'm always wary of that. But then you have inputs from the pharmaceutical industry, and you have an almost collusion there. 85% of the antibiotics in the United States are given to livestock. Monsanto, which was the creator of Roundup, glyphosate, which we talked about, this patented herbicide antibiotic, was bought by Bayer, which is one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies. And I think that there comes a point, and I don't even think it's conspiratorial anymore, where you have to ask yourself, who stands to profit? And with our food system, is there an incentive to make us sicker so that we are then dependent on the pharmaceutical industry to dig us out? And that becomes a question. And so I think this happened in service to profits. Yes, we have to feed more people, but the best way to feed more people is to create decentralized sovereign systems where people have the autonomy, the skill, and the land to feed themselves and their communities.
So well said. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think it's a conspiracy theory. I mean, these are facts. We know that Monsanto was bought by Bayer. We know that a large portion of antibiotics from pharmaceutical companies goes towards antibiotics towards cows. Like this is not made up.
No, it's not. It's not. These are clear facts. You can look them up anywhere.
Yeah. And so, some of the pieces you've said already. So, one piece you said, which I do a lot of research on, is the minerals are taken out of the soil because of the glyphosates. And maybe also because the animals aren't pooping and stepping on it and putting it into the soil as
Yes,
well.
you're creating less healthy soil. And we can kind of talk about how minerals get into soil if that's helpful, but keep going.
So we have the lack of minerals. We're having antibiotics go into cows or all animals. We're genetically modifying them to be larger. It's just, and like all of this is then going into the food we eat. And we haven't even talked about grains.
Nope.
Like we're stuffing them with grains, which
Yes.
that information is wild.
Yes.
And that is all going into our bodies. And so to me, when I think about that, to me, that is not healthy. That is not long-term aliveness or health.
No. There's an interesting line of questioning where we are what our food eats. And we can apply this to plants or animals because plants are intaking nutrition as well as animals. And all of these things or lack thereof are bioaccumulating up the food chain. And I think we're really familiar with this when we look at fish. We have this understanding that things like mercury tends to concentrate in larger fish as they eat smaller fish that eat smaller fish that eat smaller fish. But the same is true on all land-based animals. And I really love this idea of minerals. I think that there's a beautiful reciprocity that happens in soil and an understanding of how that changes the entire food system. And so within the soil at the site of the plant root, you have this beautiful concert of different organisms working together, really in collaboration to exchange and give different compounds to one another. And so the plant takes carbon from the atmosphere and draws it down into their root systems. And they exchange carbon with all of these different players, whether it's little bacteria or mycelium, to gain minerals or to gain protection in their root system or to gain nitrogen. And so what happens deep in there is that you have fungi inside of the soil that secrete organic acids that break down rocks and liberate minerals from these rocks and then exchange those minerals for carbon at the plant root. And then those minerals go into the plant. And then usually that plant is eaten by something like a ruminant, a cow, a sheep, a goat, that those minerals then go into their tissues, and they are able to either receive vitamins from the plant as well, or they create vitamins in conjunction with their gut microbiome. And all of these, so there's just this concert of collaboration all the way up the food chain. But what we're seeing now is that for plants, there's about 30 to 50% fewer vitamins, minerals, and secondary compounds, which are going to be phytochemicals. Fred Pivenza and Dr. Stefan Van Vliet talk a lot about this, but these are going to be your beta carotene, like your carotenoids and your terpenes, these sort of antioxidant compounds that we think of. 30 to 50% less in plants, and about 15 to 20% less in animals over the last 50 years. There are now oranges that don't have any vitamin C in them.
What?
Which is crazy.
Yeah.
Which is just totally wild. And so what we've done is that we have extracted so much from the soil that there is nothing to give to these plants. And we are growing these things on life support from petroleum fertilizer products. instead of the original fertilizer, right? Nature's fertilizer, blood, bones, decaying bodies, and manure. That is the fertilizer of nature. That's it. That's all there is. And Lear Keith does a really good job of talking about this. If you haven't read The Vegetarian Myth by Lear Keith. But what's happened is that then our food sources are devoid of these things that we depend on for health. And vitamins are the obvious ones, but some of these trace minerals that we consider just really small constituents of our diets, while they may be small, are incredibly important to the functioning of our cells, to the functioning of our mitochondria, and to our overall health. These are things like zinc and magnesium and selenium. And we're losing that. And with that, I believe we're losing vitality.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We're losing health. Exactly. We're losing health. And what our food is eating is no longer healthy. Those plant materials are no longer healthy because they're not grown in healthy soils. And our animals are no longer as healthy. And you mentioned grain feeding in cattle that are meant to only eat grass and different grass species and shrubs creates massive amounts of inflammation, just like it does oftentimes in people. And so these cattle oftentimes are actually in the process of dying and going lame, but because they're slaughtered at such a young age, that doesn't happen, but they are very unhealthy. And so there is this idea, and there's a beautiful book by David Montgomery and Ann Bickley called What Your Food Ate. And it's about this relationship between soil health and human health. Because ultimately, everything we're eating depends on that healthy soil food web to confer all of those nutrients up the food chain and then come to you, whether you're eating an orange or kale or you're eating a steak.
So if you take a piece of meat, let's say a piece of steak that came from grass-fed, healthy soil farm that wasn't used with glyphosate, they're eating that, and then we eat that. Are we going to be getting more minerals than a cow that's eating glyphosate, corn, and soy, and then we eat that steak is going to have way less minerals?
Yes. So we are getting a better density of minerals. Yes. Also of these secondary compounds called phytonutrients. This is something that Dr. Stefan Van Vliet calls the dark matter of nutrition. And this is his realm, but he has shown that there are, depending on what you're looking at, and even depending on the regenerative practices, right? Some regenerative practices are better than others, that you can see a 30 to 60 and even greater percent increase in these secondary phytochemical compounds in meat. And we don't think of meat as having antioxidants or phytochemicals. We think of that as the realm of acai berries and blueberries, but these are in meat too, especially when it's raised with the soil in mind. And we're seeing a better density of the trace minerals that we would expect, things like zinc and selenium.
Yeah. And to add people in my audience that might not know this, I mean, that's really when my health, that was the first thing I started to do this year, was take magnesium, start to work with these different minerals. I was so minerally depleted. And so these minerals make a really big difference for our own health and how we feel. Huge difference.
Really big difference. And they're concentrated too. I think this bears mentioning in organ meats. Many vitamins are, especially when we're looking at the B vitamins and iron, concentrated in organ meats. But organ meats are also going to have higher concentrations of zinc, of selenium, and of copper. And I think that this bears mentioning because minerals can actually be a little antagonistic with one another. And so if you constantly high supplement zinc, you can deplete copper. So they kind of work like a seesaw. But within the whole food matrix, these are in perfect ratio. And so within beef liver, zinc and copper, or within oysters, zinc and copper are going to be in that precise ratio.
Which is some of the reason when people say, well, I just take vitamins, I just take supplements, I'm fine. And my argument is, no, you're not fine. One, because they're fake, they're not real, they're not coming from food. And two, they're not synergistic in that form.
Perfect word. Yes, they're not synergistic. And I think supplementation can have its place with specificity, but I think it is always a food first approach.
Yeah. I love that you brought up organ meat. That was the first real thing I started to eat was beef liver. And I still do. I do it raw a couple times a week. And I can tell I'm really in tune with, I've done a lot of work with my body. I'm really in tune with how I feel, what's going on. So I can tell if a couple days go by and I start to feel like a little bit flat and I start thinking, oh, I haven't had liver in a few days.
It's amazing. It's incredible that you can actually feel those effects and pretty quickly, like almost like you're having a half a cup of coffee and it just gives you a zing and a zest. And that is those vitamins and those minerals are at play in those moments as all of a sudden your cells are receiving this deep nourishment.
So I was talking to my mom and stepdad just about my childhood and our food journey. And he said in the 60s, when he was a boy, he ate cow liver and cow tongue and heart. And I guess he said in the 60s, there was a really big push to have organ meats, eat the whole cow, nose to tail, as I guess the term might be called. And then that stopped. But he said in the 60s, that's how he grew up. And he didn't love it, but he did it because that's what was happening. And then in about the 70s, I think maybe that's when we moved more towards this larger CAFO model. Was that about the 70s?
Yes, a couple of things are happening. Do you want me to kind of cover some history that's happening there?
Sure.
There's a couple of things that play around that time. And the first is that Eisenhower has a heart attack in the 50s. I think it was 50s, 60s. And heart attacks weren't very common at this point. And around that same time, there was a gentleman named Ansel Keys, who was a researcher, and he did something called the 7-country study. And this study looked at 7 countries and showed that countries that ate less fat from animals had lower instances of heart disease and cardiovascular disease. And this was picked up by every media outlet. And you can look up the Time magazine cover with a eggs and a frowny face of bacon touting this Ansel Keys study. And it really became parroted. And he had some detractors, but they were quickly sort of silenced. And this became the prevailing narrative that animal fats, that saturated fats were bad for human health. And this really took animals out of the game. At the same time, now what ended up happening was that there were 22 countries and Ansel Keys had cherry-picked his data and had just decided to include the 7 countries that fit with his hypothesis. Gary Taubes does an incredible job of breaking this down in the case against sugar. So does Nina Teicholz in the Big Fat Surprise, which is an incredible book looking at sort of the history of the vilification of animal meats and of fats. And so what happens is we begin really focusing on more low-fat ingredients. So it's all low-fat yogurt, all of these different things. And to replace the mouthfeel and the delicious sensation that is fat, we use a lot of added sugars and we use further processing of foods to remove this fat, as in the case of yogurt, which is just naturally a full fat thing. And at the end of World War II, as people came home, there was a bigger push towards convenience. And in the 1960s and 70s, this is when microwaves and microwave meals are really championed. And well, this is a good thing, right? And I don't want to mix this up. Women go to work, and this sort of dinner at the family table really begins to shift and change. And I think there's There's other influences and players here. In 1977, the Secretary of Agriculture in the United States told agriculture that you had to go big or get out. I think we've all heard that get big or get out term applied elsewhere, but it was Earl Butz, who was the Secretary of Ag at that same time, who said that. And what he meant was that we needed to further concentrate our agricultural interests and grow them to be big corporations. So there are a lot of little historical threads happening right around that time that are really shifting and shaping the diet culture of, honestly, the next 40 years.
Yeah, I feel like I was born in 1980. I did not eat fat growing up. Fat was bad. Everything was fat-free.
Me too.
The other one I actually am just getting over this year is salt is bad, which is a mineral.
And packed full of all the best stuff. I'm very passionate about salt.
I am now.
Have you read The Salt Fix by James DeNicolantonio?
No, I'm writing down all these books as you name them.
I don't mean to give you a library. This is I really enjoy reading. The Salt Fix is wonderful and really details that. He also wrote a book called The Mineral Fix, which dives deep into minerals.
Amazing. So I was kind of on the tail end of that, of where, go big or go home. And so then there's even more movement towards this type of conventional farming, mass produced cows. Fat's bad, a lot of production. We have to use glyphosate in order to keep up with that. And
seed oils, I should have mentioned this. Seed oils also come on the scene to replace animal fats. And so these are quote unquote vegetable oils that are high in omega-6s and very inflammatory for our human organism.
And yeah, so you're like naming all of these things and all these different pieces of history. And you also made the statement that according to I forget the gentleman that did the research study that suddenly said, fat's linked to cardiovascular disease and we need to have
Ansel
less
Keys.
fat. Ansel Keys. I'm like listening to all of this and going, but all of this makes us less healthy. Like in the long run, the things we know now. And then my mind is also blown because when we grain feed animals, isn't that what makes them fat?
It is, yes. When we feed animals grains, they become fatter much, much faster.
And so that kind of seems like, so if you're saying the animal fat is causing cardiovascular disease, why are you grain feeding them to increase this when that might not be the case if you're allowing it to be the more traditional holistic way of farming? Am I off base here thinking that?
That's really interesting. Nobody's ever really brought that up, and I want to consider that for a second. We're continuing to grain feed because it's profitable. And while we're telling people to eat less saturated fat, and red meat consumption does dramatically reduce over this time period, and chicken increases, which is considered a leaner meat. And so we eat a lot more chicken, we eat a little bit more pork, and we really drop our red meat consumption. But from a corporation's point of view, they're not concerned about the health of the end consumer. They just want to continue to make profits in this declining sector of agriculture. But we're also grain feeding our chickens at an alarming rate, and our chickens are changing very much, and we're feeding them mostly corn and soy and changing their fat and meat composition of the fats that they have in their meat. And so do you want me to dive into this a little bit?
Yeah, I'm like super into everything you're saying.
Yeah. So as humans, there's something called we have omega-3 fats and omega-6 fats. And I won't get into the biochemistry of these fats, but you can think of them, when we hear omega-3 fats, we often think of fish is a common one. And omega-6 fats we're going to find in nuts and seeds. Now, from an evolutionary perspective, we would have had an abundance of omega-3 fats. We would have had access to fish and to animal meats, and nuts and seeds would have been really something that we would have had very few of. They're hard to open, hard to get at. You can only gather so much at a time, and they're incredibly seasonal. And so ancestrally, our omega-3 to omega-6 fatty acid ratio would have been about 1-to-1 or 1-to-2, which attributes to about 6 to 8% of omega-6 fatty acids in our cell membranes. This is what is making up every cell membrane. Now let's fast forward to now. Now the average American's omega-3 to omega-6 ratio is about 1-to-18 to 1-to-22. So that's 22 omega-6 fatty acids for every 1 omega-3 fatty acid.
Oh my God.
In our cell membranes.
My jaws dropped. I'm like, oh.
In our cell membranes, this attributes to about a 33% composition of omega-6 fatty acids in our cell membranes. Now, this is pretty wild. And there are a lot of people that think that this is probably the main driver of a lot of inflammation, of a lot of insulin resistance, and ultimately of a lot of disease, are eating these vegetable or seed oils. These are going to be things like canola oil, grapeseed oil, peanut oil, sunflower oil, safflower oil, the list goes on. And they're not a part of our diet. What it takes to process these seed oils is heroic. And there is a video on YouTube, and you can see how they press out these seed oils and use high heat. They use all of these deodorizers, all of these chemicals to make them smell better and taste okay. And it is just very far from what we evolved to eat. And to go back to that conversation that we started with regenerative agriculture, I think that when we're seeking health, whether that's of a human organism or an ecosystem or of a cow that we're eventually going to eat, we're seeking for it to be as close to in balance from its natural evolutionary habitat as possible.
Wow. I'm just giving my nervous system a moment to pause from that's wild.
Mm-hmm. It is. It is. We are very far away. And this is all a byproduct of industry. When you look at the history of seed oils, we had all of these cotton seeds left over from the cotton industry, and we began to press them and figured out we could get oil from them. And it was used as an industrial lubricant. But then it sort of made its way, and other seeds found their way into things like Crisco. And initially, Crisco wasn't meant for human consumption, but it was clear that here we could get yet more money out of these products and create an entire industry around seed oils. And we could use them in margarine and low-fat snack items.
Wow. Wow. Yeah. I mean, all of this, I'm like, yeah, this is why we're so, as a country, so unhealthy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's not just the US anymore. I mean, this way of living, this way of eating is making its way around the globe.
Wow. Huh. And I mean, it's very much reflected in how much we're spending towards chronic illness, chronic disease. Our infertility rates for men now is very, very high. It used to be more so women, but now it's just as much men.
Should we check those off, like in numbers really quick?
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah. So we spend $3.8 to $4 trillion each year on healthcare spending in the United States out of a GDP that sits at about 28.5 trillion. So that is an appreciable amount. For comparison, we spend about $800 billion on military spending. So almost 6 times less than what we spend on healthcare spending. Sperm counts have decreased at a rate of 1% per year since 1960, and testosterone levels are about half of what they used to be, with most 35 to 40-year-olds having the testosterone levels that their grandfathers would have had in their mid-70s.
Oh my God. People that are listening don't know that my eyes are like popping out of my head.
Yeah. Yeah. And our fertility is declining. And this is actually getting picked up in the mainstream. There was an article just this last week that men are being deemed sub-fertile. The work of Shauna Swan, who wrote the book Countdown. She also has an excellent podcast episode on Joe Rogan, talks a lot about tracking these declining fertility rates. But we're also seeing issues with women becoming pregnant. And those numbers are a little bit harder to pinpoint.
When you say women becoming pregnant, having a hard time to get pregnant.
Yes, having a hard time conceiving. And the reason we have such great statistics on men is actually because sperm banks have to track the density of sperm in order to receive them. So you have to have a certain number of healthy sperm in order to donate sperm from sperm banks. And so this is a very closely looked at number, and the amount of people that get rejected from sperm banks has multiplied and increased pretty wildly in the last 20 years.
Wow. I'm also wondering, and I don't know if there's any statistics or research on this, but one of the reasons for me why working with my health right now is I want to go through menopause in a healthy way. Like,
yes.
I know, and unfortunately, when we hear about menopause in society, and I have friends going through it or family members that have gone through it, I haven't met a woman that has said, I feel good. That was a good experience. I'm okay. Aftermath, they're more in that crone stage. They're like, yeah, life is good. But the during, and I watch this happen and I just think, I don't think that's normal.
I don't either. And I've thought a lot about this. My mother went through early menopause at 41, 42, which is something that I would like to avoid if at all possible. I would like to push that back, but I would like to, like you, I would like to experience a healthy menopause. And the first time I heard somebody talk about it was just this past fall. And I was speaking with a guest on my podcast who talked about having I think she's 51, 52, just now really shifting into menopause. And she doesn't notice any hot flashes unless she eats grains and kind of goes into some more inflammatory foods. And she said she noticed how much that exacerbated these things. And I think that you really hit the nail on the head, because we've talked a lot about hormone health for menstrual cycles. And I think this next step is to talk about how to shift from mother to crone with grace and with ease.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And stop. I mean, you talk about this a lot, actually, more with death of it's something that's not talked about in our culture. In menopause, like I said, I haven't gone through it, but I view menopause as a type of death.
Oh, absolutely. It is yes.
And it's not in our culture. We don't talk about it. We hide it, and we don't have hardly any research on it. We don't support women going through it. So this journey of matrescence to crone just is this huge, unknown, not okay thing to talk about. And in my world, I'm like, I'm 42. Let's start preparing. Let's bring this out of the closet and out of the void and start to have conversations around this.
There is a culture, and I do not remember what it is, for which I apologize. I will find it after this, that believes that during pregnancy, we hold our blood in so that we can build a child. And they believe that during menopause, we hold our blood in so we can build wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
I just thought I'd share that because I think it really fits, and it is a death. We experience these phases of life, and between each, in these moments of transition, there is a death of self. And I think that's something that we need to acknowledge. We need to be having these funerals for the people we were, whether that's emotionally or spiritually or biologically, and to mark these transitions and to celebrate them in community, to put them out in that space where we as women are supporting one another as we go through each of these steps of life.
Yeah. You know, it's so interesting. I have a good friend I mentioned earlier. She, the child of her, how do I say this? The father of her child owns a farm. And she's kind of who I turn to ask a lot of questions and kind of ask these things around nutrition, which is where we started this conversation. But a lot of what our conversation is about death. And it's why my family turned vegetarian after my sister did that report. It's because they decided we're not going to participate in that type of slaughtering. And, you know, so I think that's one thing I really had to sit with. That's actually how I found you, was I was sharing in stories my little bit of a journey of starting to eat meat from being vegan again. And you know, questioning all these things. And a friend of mine said, I think you need to listen to this podcast. And it was your podcast where you were interviewed by Death in the Garden.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I listened to that podcast and I was like, oh my God, finally someone's talking about the death part.
Mm-hmm.
Finally someone, because that is a big piece, I think, for me, as being a vegetarian and a vegan so long, was like, I can't cause animals to die. I didn't want that responsibility. I also had not gone through a massive life change and had learned to sit with what death means in form of either people dying or parts of myself dying. I wasn't taught that.
None of us were, or most of us weren't. I mean, the vast majority of us have not experienced death and witnessed it and been taught about it. It's something that we hide away in our culture.
Yeah. And I know you just released yesterday, and I'll link it in the show notes, but you just did a whole podcast, I think, on death that came out yesterday. I haven't listened to it yet.
We did a whole podcast on, it's with Anna Borgman, and she works in a slaughterhouse in Montana. And we talk a lot about death and in that part of the food chain, but also our own fears surrounding death.
And so do you think, I mean, for me, that's just my own personal journey. Like, I chose not to eat animal for a long time because of this whole death piece and the removal of it. Do you find that to be a common statement from people as you've been interviewing and talking?
Yes, absolutely. And I think 10, 12 years of working at a butcher shop and speaking with a lot of former vegans and vegetarians, and even my own journey, a lot of this has been about avoiding death, which I find really interesting and tender. And this is a space that I always want to hold with tenderness, because so many of us weren't raised with a lot of knowledge around death or seeing death. But death is inherent to our food system, whether it's on a small decentralized scale or a large centralized scale, whether we're talking about plants and growing a monocrop field of kale, or we're talking about animals. Death is something that is baked in, and it is in many ways a beautiful inevitability that we are all going to go through and experience. And when I became a vegetarian as a kid, it was very much about avoidance of death and this idea that I felt out of control, that the idea of death made me feel out of control. And here was this thing that I could control my relationship to death. And I think a lot of us feel that way or something similar. But what I see the closer I get to things is that death is a very sacred part of this. And our connection to that, whether we were hunters and gatherers, or we were at the dawn of agriculture, we would have been part and borne witness to death with some frequency, and how it changed the animals and the people around us. We talked about nourishing the soil, and one of the things soil loves the most is phosphorus from bones and nitrogen from blood. And what we see when a fox decays in the forest is that that is really going to feed the soil, and that those minerals, those nutrients, are going to begin to break down and then go into the soil and then go back into the plant matter in that space that will then be eaten by animals. And that there is this cycle and this reciprocity, that death might be the end of one thing, but it is the beginning of life for many other things and the continuation of life. And I think even if we were to track one of those minerals, a little bit of phosphorus, a little bit of zinc, in its journey through being part of an animal and to being part of the soil and to being part of a plant and an animal again and into us, there is this idea of infinite process through time. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I wanted as I learned how to be a butcher and then got into farming was to be closer to death, even though I'm still, and I don't want to speak from this place that I have it all figured out, because I don't. I still hold deep fears for death, but I also have gotten to witness how sacred death is, and to see that it is and can be a moment of expansion beyond the sort of tight confines of our body, like slipping off a tight pair of blue jeans is how I imagine it, and just becoming something so much greater. And Don Miguel Ruiz talks about this in the Four Agreements. I'll double check that, but it's one of my favorite lenses to look at death. But I think it's also important to remember, and this is something I've been looking into lately, it used to be that when our loved ones died, that we were the people that laid them to rest, that we washed the bodies and we built the coffins and we dug the graves on our land, and we sat with our dead in various forms of wakes in different cultures. And we have really outsourced all of dying. And so we outsource it to hospice, and we outsource it to hospitals and funeral homes and slaughterhouses. And in a culture that originally, like, you would have at least had chickens in your backyard, and you would have taken care of your dead loved ones many, many years ago. We've lost any connection to that. And anytime we don't see something, we lose our understanding of it and we begin to fear it. Mm. And I think that this has created a lot of avoidance of death.
Yeah, a lot of fear of death. So much so, I have friends that will be like, oh yeah, I eat meat once in a while, but it grosses me out and I can hardly touch it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I hear that a lot as a butcher, and do a lot of touching of meat for other people so that they don't have to touch it. But I think it's a beautiful thing to connect with your food in the physical realm, to touch your food, to salt your meat, to recognize that we're all made up of these same component parts that were once stardust in the universe and then became rocks, that then became minerals liberated by fungi and came into our tissues, and to see that reflection. And I think that sometimes that's hard, but I also wonder, as we experience so many people that feel a sense of disconnection, and I think that manifests a lot of different ways in our culture, that one of the greatest connections of our life, one of the things that ancestrally we would have been built on, was connecting with our food. It was hunting and gathering and preparing and eating our food.
Yeah. And having that death I'll be a part of each step along the way.
Each step. Yes.
And I'm sure you know this, in Chinese medicine, the heart meridian line comes up and out through the palms of the hands.
Mm.
So it's like our heart meridian are our arms. And so, we're hugging people and it's an extension of our heart. And for me, that's what cooking is, and that's what food is. And that's why I like to touch food and be
Me too.
connected to my food. It's like such a visceral, well, I'm also a body worker. So I'm like, you can see my hands are moving. I'm like, such a visceral experience. And it is my way to nourish and like put my love into the food, is just like to touch it.
Mhm.
And I really had to go through this process. And I share this for anyone who is, in that transition of vegan or vegetarian or meat eating or questioning these things of, I had to create a private ritual or honoring every time I cook meat, because I'm not out there slaughtering, I'm not butchering, I'm getting it from the farm and bringing it. And I have a desire to go deeper at this point. I joke with my husband, I'm like, we're going to own a farm one day, like just wait. But it's really that piece of like, I take a moment and I honor the life of the animal that I'm about to cook and touch, and then take in its nutrients. It's then going to give me life.
I think
So blessed.
I just think that's so beautiful. And I think that's such a stunning way to connect to something, both in the physical, but also to have a ritual that is almost spiritual in nature. As you were talking, there was one more thing I wanted to mention, and I think that this is really important. I'm not sure there is anything more intimate than eating. And I've thought a lot about this over the years, but we are literally putting something inside of our body. And as soon as we break that first boundary of our mouths and take what we perceive as the inside, though really, your mouth extends to your stomach and your intestines and to your anus. And if you look at that, it's actually outside of your body. Like whatever you put through your digestive tract is still outside of your body. But we break this barrier, this boundary, when we lift fork to mouth and we begin to chew our food. And then again, inside of our intestines, which are, one cell thick, these nutrients from our food pass through that and become a part of us. And this is a true intimacy. One of the definitions of intimacy is a union of particles. And here at a cellular level, we are yoked together with the constituent components of our food in what is probably one of the more intimate acts, up there with sex and with pregnancy, with sharing a body. And so anything that's intimate is going to have a lot of emotional tension and a lot of emotions around it. And especially for those of us that didn't eat meat, to go back into that space, this is tender and intimate, and it brings up a lot of different emotions, a whole wide range of things. With any of our food, I think that this is part of why leaving foods behind or adopting new foods can feel so intense, because it's intimate.
I love how you brought up this idea of intimacy being linked and emotional tension. So really sitting with, I often try to sit with both and.
I love that.
Yeah. And I'm blanking his name. Oh, integral theory. Ken Wilber was kind of the one that talked a lot about both and how both and is actually a part of human development. So it's literally a huge leap in our human development when someone can literally sit in both and. Before this developmental leap, we're sitting in the two camps, one or the other. And so for me, I'm just thinking, oh, okay, intimacy and emotional connection, like sitting in the both and-ness of that. And I emailed you before this podcast and just said, I'm so moved by your story. And I think a big reason why is you're helping me connect the connection between food and like life and death. Because those are the things that if I sit down and like sit with them, or I'm involved with them and allow myself to like really be embodied by them, I find myself crying.
Mm.
And it really is like, because there's intimacy and emotional attention with those things for me: death, birth, food. So thank you.
Oh, well, thank you for sharing that. I love that you're able to sit with that. I think that speaks volumes to the work that you've done and the work that you do and the work that you're doing in the world, that you can just be in that space and feel the ripeness of those connections and how it resonates in your body, and to allow that to pass through you and to be with you. So I really want to see that in return.
Thank you. I mean, I want, I want everyone to kind of, everyone's on their own journey and everyone has their own experiences and their own life processes that they have to go through, and their own previous conditionings and traumas. And at the same time, I'm like, oh, can the whole world just come to this place of intimacy and intimacy with like food and sex and love and death?
And I think there is that potential in many ways. I think that was there for a time as humans. And I think that there is the potential for us to return to that. And I think that, like any death process, it requires us to experience again grief, to feel our own grief for what we have lost on a personal level, on a collective level, and to go into that space and to be transformed by it. And transformed into a space, you talked about birth and death, and one of the things I love listening to recounts of near-death experiences and death. So often we experience a warm and connected and loving darkness followed by a tunnel of light. And you can't help but think about the birth canal and how birth is death, right? Like the birth, when you give birth, that child, that warm, aqueous, perfect environment is it's the only thing it's ever known. And to traverse through the birth canal is a death of everything that little being has ever known. And so they're all connected, right? Birth and life and death, they're almost impossible to tease out from one another. They are the pieces of the same.
Yeah. It's interesting that you said you loved reading. I'll go back to this birth and death piece. So just a little side note of, you loved reading accounts of near-death experiences. And that was actually the first book I read, Many Lives, Many Masters. Do you know that book?
No, I don't, but I'm writing it down right now.
It's really old. That was the first like quote unquote spiritual book I read. And it's kind of what made me go, oh, okay, there's more out there. There's something out there. Yeah, I think you'll get a kick out of that book.
Okay, I'm really excited about this one, and I'll throw in here that like these thoughts are what has connected me to something spiritually, to see all of these threads woven together and to feel held by that space, that it is so closely connected.
Well, and I've read, and I'm wondering if you've heard of this or how you feel about this. I've read that in some cultures, women actually are the hunters and the butchers because they hold the veil between life and death.
I've never heard it put that way, but I really love that. And I think there is something that women and girls both find very interesting about this. For a while in Denver, we had a little satellite butcher shop, and it had this really big window, and you could watch us as we would butcher and take apart these animals. And a lot of people would stop and watch. But I think the biggest demographic for it were girls around age 7 or 8. Right in there. And there was just this fascination, and they would watch the longest and the most intently. And I really like that. I haven't heard that, but there is a closeness to that veil, that this capacity to create life really joins us in that thin space that's in between.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's just such a beautiful space. Anytime working through birth work, working with clients with birth work, or sitting with a loved one who is passing, whether it's birth or death, like there's something so distinct about that place and about that energy. Do you notice that with animals? Because you're delivering animals on the farm, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Or not
Yeah.
delivering, you're there.
They never need help. They never need anybody to tell them what to do. They just know. And that is beautiful to witness, like to witness animals give birth and mother through their own internal wisdom is one of the most expansive experiences.
Yeah. And it just shows to me, watching animals birth and women birth without intervention, like we know what we're doing. Our bodies know what we're doing.
Yes, pregnancy is not a pathology. It is the most natural state of being. It is why we are here.
Yeah.
And in both of those places, and this is what I'll say, there is a charge in the atmosphere that I can't explain. And they both come with a similar smell too. I think that both birth and death have this specific astringency to them. And there is a feeling of expansion, right? That moment when an animal passes into the in-between space, into that liminal existence, there is a feeling that they have expanded beyond the container of their body. And with birth too, there is this experience of the expansion of a being into the world. And I think both of them, go through these contractions, just like the birth of the universe, right? Like the universe, like it's so small and then expands outwards. And now it expands and contracts and expands and contracts. And I think that you can see those contractions and those expansions in both places, and just these little fizzy electrical atmosphere feelings, and just a sense of something. There's peace in that liminal space too.
Yeah, there really is. It's like very quiet and still.
Mm-hmm.
Do you guys slaughter right on the farm?
We do. So my husband and I raise all of our own meat, and we both hunt and we raise cattle and pork and goat and chicken and duck and goose. And we do everything on farm ourselves, animals that have been born here and raised here, and then they die here comfortably in pastures they know and love with us, who they're used to. It is zero stress and a really beautiful process. It's a hard process too, because we're connected to them, and we don't withhold love to animals that are going to be food. We continue to love them in the same way that we love all of our animals. And so those moments are everything that is both and. They are, there is grief and there is sadness and there is reverence and there is joy at filling our freezers and nourishing our bodies. It is the full spectrum of human emotion in those moments.
Yeah. Have you ever had people say to you, and again, this was before I started doing all my research and diving into these pieces and the different aspects of farming and the different ways of farming, but Do you ever have people kind of say to you, like, well, you're hurting the animals or you're hurting the land, or like you're actually hurting, not helping? And, kind of just not what is the response in the way of, hey, actually, I'm helping the system. I'm being a part of nature.
Hmm. It's a really good question. And I think I'm still playing with what response is best, because in some ways we're all on our own journeys to find where we operate in the world and how we view these connections. And it's all of our life experiences leading up until that point, and to recognize that another's fear or judgment is not a reflection of what I'm doing, but is just a reflection of where they are on their journey. And sometimes almost just wanting to let that be. And there is a space where I think we imagine that there's this utopian space where nothing is hurt and death doesn't happen, and we can get out of all of these things, and nature is just infinite peace. But there are these moments of death, of birth, of killing an animal that are charged in a different way. Nature is as peaceful and giving as she is violent. And anybody who's watched animals hunt or tornadoes whip through the plains begins to understand this. And I don't want to say to someone that that animal doesn't hurt, because it's not an experience that I've had. I don't think it could possibly hurt for long. All of these deaths are as swift as you could ever imagine, maybe lasting seconds. But I don't want to discount an experience that I haven't had and can't fathom. But I do believe that this is a part of the cycle and a part of the system. And I believe that I, as a human, have a part in this cycle and system. And for hundreds of thousands of years, we have been a predator that is a part of an ecosystem. And while that might look a little bit different now, I think that it still has its place. This is something I've talked about a lot. And so I hope see how it comes out. But I do think that it has its place. And so I think the first thing I really want to emphasize is that I don't want to gaslight it and say that it's perfect or that no harm happens ever, because that just wouldn't be true. But I think what is true is that most farmers are doing their absolute best to create the best possible system for animals and environments, to increase their connectivity with the land, with their animals, to make death as swift and painless as we can imagine.
Yeah, well said.
Good. I haven't talked about that much, and I wasn't sure how that came out, but I appreciate you asking that question and the opportunity to try that on.
Yeah, no, it came out really well. And just, it's the question I sit with often, am I causing harm, or am I doing good?
Mm-hmm.
And what's the path of least harm for all beings involved? I guess that's like very Buddhist philosophy, but
yeah. I think for me in my witnessing of this, that this is the path of least harm and most connected, most in its place in the cycle.
Yeah. I mean, like you said, we are part of that cycle. We are predators. This is part of how it is.
It is. And one of the things I've thought a lot lately is how often we use language to apply to humans that removes us from the environment, that the environment is outside of us, that we are not a part of the environment, that we are a scourge or a blight on the earth. And to begin to re-foster that connection, because I think it's actually that disconnection that is symptomatic of some of the extractive, profit-driven, exploitative things that we've talked about throughout this podcast. But to actually step back into that connection, that I am nature, I am a part of nature, I am a part of the environment, that it is from that connectivity that we do the least harm, and that we seek to be the best stewards or the best co-creators with nature that we can be.
Yeah. I really appreciate the perspective too from the farmer. I think that farmers have been vilified and seen as maybe the quote unquote bad person. And that's not the case at all.
No, it isn't. And any farmer, whether they are conventional or regenerative, that I have ever met, and I have met a lot of them, are all farming with the best intentions. And I think that we are in a strange space in society where we are want to put the onus on individuals and to point the finger at individuals instead of corporations. And I actually think that's by design, that we often point to a problem, and the problem is an individual group of people instead of the corporate engine that is driving that problem. And I think that farmers have really exemplified that. And most farmers, even those that are in the deepest depths of the conventional system, are there because they want to feed their family. They don't know a different way. They are institutionalized and deep in debt at the hands of these corporations and just trying to dig themselves out. And so it's important to take a step back and say, and to see that, right? To see that spectrum of humanity that exists within that spectrum of farming, that most people are just doing their best and oftentimes are stuck in a bad paradigm that's almost impossible to get out of.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for naming that. Oh, wow. I feel like we went all over from nutrition to history to menopause.
Uh-huh. Yeah. I love it. I feel like we've included so many beautiful threads. I'm not sure how it weaves together, but hopefully it is weaving together.
Yeah. Weaving through nature and connection and meat.
Mm-hmm. And the cycles of our own human woman bodies.
Yeah. Anything else that you want to share? I mean, like I said, we've gone all over, but if there's anything else that you're like, actually, I want to share this.
We touched on a lot of things that are very present in my heart today, something I'm really grateful for. I think that there is something magical about podcasting, that when a host like you can be so present and can be such a stunning container for conversation to unfold, that you often, and occasionally when I have a great podcast, I can be this, you often pull out exactly what's in that person's heart in those moments. And this was one of those podcasts for me. You teased out a lot of what was in my heart and in my mind. And so I'm really appreciative for that. And I don't think I have any icing on the cake, any cherry on top, other than to say that you really understood what was in my ether, and we're just a beautiful space for that to unfurl.
Thank you, Kate. I was really nervous for today.
Well, I didn't feel that at all.
Yeah, no, as soon as I met you, everything was like, oh, this is fine.
I'm a really nervous podcaster. I invited somebody on and they said that it sounded like terrifying fun. And I think as a host, that's what I experience every time I turn the mic on. I terrified, but excited, which is a fine line, right? Like that is a very fine edge of both.
Yeah, I don't know the exact statistic or the exact mechanism, but there's a saying that excitement and fear is one molecule of a difference.
Mm-hmm.
And
Love that.
it's like you can really easily tip between the two. And I even ask myself that a lot. I'm like, am I actually nervous and scared right now, or am I just actually excited?
I do too. I do too, especially as an anxious person that's prone to anxiety. That's something I check in on. And sometimes I actually work to flip it. Go, I am scared. Could this be excitement? Could I make this a little bit? Could I add a little bit excitement in with that fear?
Yeah, how can I make this exciting? Yeah.
Especially for things like this that are, I mean, there's no need to fear these beautiful ways of connecting with other humans. And I think that's what podcasts are. I think of them as a modern campfire, that this is a place for us to gather around and share stories and to be connected, even if it's through many miles and a computer screen.
Yeah. Yeah. It really has opened. My podcast is very new, and it has opened up already amazing avenues and ways of connecting with people. So
Yeah. Well, I'm glad to hear it.
and speaking of podcasts, you have your own podcast. It's awesome. Those of you that have not tuned in to Kate's work, please go check out her podcast called Groundwork. And I will let you share how people can find you, because there's a couple places where people can find you.
Yeah, so you can go to groundworkcollective.com and you can find the podcast. You can also find our farm finder there. There's a little button in the top right corner if you're looking to find a farmer or rancher near you. And it's all regenerative farms across the United States. And so I want to leave everyone with that. You can find me on Instagram at Kate, Kate _ Kavanaugh, Kavanaughh. And you can find me on my podcast, the Groundwork Podcast. And we look at the interconnected themes of mind, body, and soil. And it's wherever you listen to podcasts.
And it's such a great podcast. And like I said, I'm really excited to tune in on the one that you just released on death.
That one with Anna Borgman was really good. I also just had one with Lily Nichols that your audience might appreciate. And we talk a lot about the similarities and difference in birth and nutrition and livestock, and birth and nutrition throughout the conception, preconception, pregnancy, and postpartum in humans.
Yes, I appreciate that podcast. That's actually what gave me the urge to finally reach out to you. Was listening to that podcast and Lily Nichols' information, and it's mind-blowing. I think I went and bought her book as I was listening to your podcast.
It's an incredible book. And I think, just to mention this, we know more about livestock nutrition during pregnancy and postpartum than we do about human nutrition. And lactation as well. And it's well known that animals need more salt. You mentioned salt. They need more salt in lactation. Sheep, if they're by the ocean, will drink seawater prior to giving birth in order to up their salt and mineral and iodine stores so that they can increase lactation. Dairy farmers know that to increase lactation, you keep salt on hand. Talk a lot about adding selenium and copper to the diets of animals that you're planning on breeding. So it's an interesting difference. And Lily said something within the context of this podcast that I think is really interesting, which is nobody stands to make money from humans breastfeeding, but we make a lot of money from cows giving milk and concentrating that. And so there's no incentive to study it. I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, that is really fascinating. Definitely, especially that's a majority of who I still do body work with are lactating mothers.
Oh, beautiful. What a beautiful time I'm sorry, there's a big storm and I think my electricity is a little shaky. So if I dip out, that's why.
Okay.
I don't know if you can hear it. This is pretty wild, but yeah, that's incredible, because I think that is a time when touch and connection from that circle of women that I think a lot of us are missing is so crucial.
So crucial, and just not enough information. So Now I'm slowly starting to sneak in some nutritional pieces.
Yeah.
And more will start happening.
Yeah. Well, I love that. It has been a pleasure, like a true pleasure speaking with you. You've created a beautiful container. And if this is who you are as a host, I know that the podcast is young, but you're doing a really beautiful job.
Wow, Kate. Thank you. Thank you so
I
much
mean
for
it.
coming on today.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. Anytime.
Awesome.